What makes Anne Boleyn's early life stand out from other noble women of her time? Anne Boleyn wasn't just any woman born into the world of English nobility. While others in her social circle lived a life of luxury and expectation, Anne was a woman who knew early on that her destiny would not be defined by the typical prescribed roles for women of her class. She had a plan, and it didn't involve just marrying a wealthy man or having children. Anne was driven by ambition, with a sharp mind and a clear understanding of how to navigate the intricate, often dangerous political landscape of 16th century Europe. Imagine this: you're a young noblewoman raised in the courtly world of Europe, and you're surrounded by powerful figures. You have access to their ideas, their knowledge, and their influence. It's almost as if Anne had a secret map to a world of power that most women would never even know existed. This wasn't a life of mere survival for Anne. It was a springboard for her to shape her future. She wasn't just passing time waiting for a good marriage proposal. She was actively learning, observing, and preparing for something greater. But here's a surprising twist. While many would think of her early life as one of privilege and comfort, Anne's time abroad, particularly in the Netherlands and France, was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it gave her access to an education and political insights that other noble women couldn't have dreamed of. On the other hand, it exposed her to political intrigue, complex courtly relationships, and the harsh reality of royal life in an era when women had very little power on their own. Anne learned to play the game of politics, and she learned it well. In the Netherlands and France, Anne wasn't just a passive observer. She actively participated in the court culture. She understood the political dynamics, including how to influence powerful men, how to win the favor of influential women, and how to protect her interests from those who could easily destroy her. This exposure to European courts shaped Anne into a politically savvy and ambitious figure who could go toe-to-toe with the most powerful men in England. Here's a fascinating fact. Anne Boleyn wasn't the only woman in her family to play a prominent role in history. Her sister, Mary Boleyn, had caught the eye of King Henry VIII before Anne had, but it was Anne's keen intellect and her ability to navigate the complex court environment that allowed her to rise above her sister and many others on the political ladder. While Mary was known for her beauty, it was Anne's sharp wit, ambition, and strategic thinking that made her stand out in Henry's eyes and ultimately secured her place in history. But let's not be mistaken. Anne wasn't content to simply marry well and live out her days as a lady of the court. She wanted more. Women of her class typically married for status or wealth, but Anne had a deeper understanding of her own potential. She understood that her future wasn't going to be about just being someone's wife. She wanted power, influence, and a legacy. As her time in the courts of Europe had taught her, true power lay not just in wealth or birthright, but in understanding the subtle, often invisible forces at play in politics. Anne wasn't just preparing to be a queen. She was preparing to change the course of England's history. It's often said that Anne's ambition was what led to her rise and her eventual downfall. But what if her true brilliance lay in her ability to perceive opportunities that others, blinded by tradition or ignorance, couldn't even see? Anne knew that marriage to Henry VIII could be the key to unlocking not just her future, but the future of her entire country. She wasn't waiting for the king to choose her. She was choosing him, and she did it in a way that no one else had ever done before. Anne's rise to power wasn't about simply playing by the rules. It was about bending the rules to suit her needs. But here's where it gets interesting. While she was using her intelligence and political understanding to climb the ranks, she also made enemies. Women who followed the more traditional paths of marriage and motherhood might have resented Anne's refusal to settle for anything less than ultimate power. And men, well, they were threatened by her intellect and her audacity to go beyond the expected roles for women. What's fascinating is that Anne's ambition wasn't just about personal gain. Her marriage to Henry VIII wasn't just a love affair. It was the beginning of a religious revolution. By strategically aligning herself with Henry's desire for a male heir, Anne became the center of a movement that would eventually reshape England's religious landscape forever. She might have been driven by a desire for personal power. Anne's actions also had enormous consequences for the kingdom. Her rise, in many ways, was the spark that ignited a new era. Here's a strange thought. Anne Boleyn, the woman who was executed by the very king who had once adored her, was in many ways one of the most powerful women in history, even though she never wore the crown for long. Her political acumen, her defiance of traditional gender roles, and her ability to manipulate the court would make her a fascinating figure for historians, and even more so for feminists who see her as an early example of a woman navigating and reshaping patriarchal systems. But this raises a serious question. What if Anne had played her cards differently? What if she had simply been content to remain Henry's mistress instead of pursuing the throne? Now, would she have lived a long, happy life as a royal concubine? Or did her ambition ultimately lead to her tragic fate? It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer. But one thing is for certain. Anne Boleyn's rise to power was anything but typical for a woman of her time, and it set the stage for one of the most dramatic and controversial reigns in English history. In the end, Anne Boleyn's early life wasn't just about privilege or being born into nobility. It was about a woman who understood the world of politics better than many of the men around her. It was about ambition, intelligence, and an unrelenting desire to break free from the constraints of tradition. It's easy to view Anne as a victim of her circumstances, executed by the very man who had once loved her. But when you dig deeper, you begin to see that Anne was, in many ways, a master of the political game. She wasn't simply playing the part that was assigned to her. She was rewriting the rules entirely. By now, you're probably thinking, I never realized how much Anne's early life shaped her destiny. But this is just the beginning of her story. Keep watching, because as we dive deeper into Anne's rise, her struggles, and her ultimate downfall, you'll start to see just how much of her life and her influence still echoes through history today. Was it love that drove Anne to Henry, or was there a deeper, more strategic motive? At the heart of Anne Boleyn's rise is a question that still fascinates historians and scholars today. Was it love that drove Anne to Henry VIII, or was there something far more strategic at play? Most people assume that the relationship between Anne and Henry was driven by passion, the kind of romantic love that results in courtly intrigue and devotion. But if we scratch beneath the surface, what we find is a much more calculated and politically charged partnership than we might expect. Anne's relationship with Henry wasn't simply a love affair. It was a masterful exercise in timing and strategy. Anne was no naive young woman swept off her feet by a king's advances. She understood Henry's weaknesses, his desires, and most crucially, his need for a male heir. Henry, obsessed with securing a future for his dynasty, had been desperately seeking a way out of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon for years. And in Anne, he saw the possibility of getting not only a new wife, but the son he so desperately needed to solidify his reign. Anne knew this. She understood that Henry's desire for a male heir was both his greatest obsession and his Achilles heel. The king had already fathered a daughter with Catherine, but no son, at least not one who had survived. Henry had begun to look elsewhere, and it was Anne, with her sharp political acumen, who positioned herself as the answer to his problem. But here's where things get complicated. Was it simply ambition that drove Anne, or was there love? The truth is likely a mixture of both, but one thing is certain. Anne's refusal to become Henry's mistress was a calculated move. She understood that by withholding herself, she increased her worth in Henry's eyes. At the time, she could have easily become another of Henry's many mistresses, but instead, she demanded more. She demanded more. She demanded marriage. By doing so, she was able to elevate herself to a position that was far more powerful and influential than any mere mistress could have hoped for. But what makes Anne's courtship so fascinating is how perfectly she timed it. Henry, in the midst of his failed marriage, was desperate. His courtship of Anne wasn't just about passion, it was about political necessity. Henry was a man who believed in his divine right to rule, and for him, having a male heir was not just a personal desire. It was a requirement for the stability of the kingdom. Anne wasn't just another beautiful woman vying for Henry's attention. She was the woman who could provide him with what he needed most, a son. But there's a strange fact about Anne's courtship that makes you wonder. Anne's position as Henry's mistress was not accidental. Anne had spent several years in the French court, learning the delicate art of courtly manipulation. She knew how to captivate a king's attention, how to walk the fine line between flirtation and power. Her time in France shaped her understanding of how royal courts operated, how to play the game, and how to secure her position not just as a lover, but as the future queen. Here's the surprising truth. Anne didn't immediately fall in love with Henry. In fact, when they first met, Anne was already aware of his reputation as a notorious womanizer, a king who had been through several wives and countless mistresses. Anne didn't enter the relationship with Henry blinded by love. She entered it knowing exactly what she was doing. She played the part of the unattainable woman, which, as history shows, is a strategy that worked. At the beginning, it might have looked like Anne was just another beautiful woman trying to win Henry's favor. But in reality, she was already thinking several steps ahead. She wasn't simply looking for a position of power. She was looking to change the entire course of English history. By refusing to sleep with him before marriage, Anne not only increased her value in Henry's eyes, but set into motion a chain of events that would lead to one of the most famous breaks in religious history, the English Reformation. Most people think of Anne's refusal as a moral stance, but in reality, it was a calculated move designed to secure her position. By making Henry wait, Anne didn't just position herself as the woman who could give him the son he so desired. She positioned herself as the queen who could change England forever. This strategic refusal set in motion not just a royal marriage, but a revolution. What's fascinating is how Anne used this strategy to her advantage. She didn't simply wait for Henry to choose her, she chose him. While he pursued her, she controlled the pace. She was the one who decided when to stay tilt and how things would unfold. And by doing so, she shaped the course of her own destiny. But what is even more remarkable is that Anne's courtship wasn't just about Henry. It was about the entire English court. The king, the nobility, and the entire country were watching, and Anne knew how to make herself the center of attention. She wasn't just another woman in Henry's life. She became a symbol of what he could have, what he could achieve, and what the future of England could be. And yet, here's the twist. While Anne was planning every move with precision, she was also walking a tightrope. Her ambition and intelligence set her apart, but they also created enemies. There were those at court who resented her for not playing the traditional game, for stepping out of the role society had prescribed for her. The more Anne succeeded, the more she threatened others in Henry's inner circle, including those who were loyal to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. The closer she got to securing Henry's heart and his crown, the more she risked losing everything. Here's the strange and often overlooked part of Anne's story. While Henry was falling for Anne, he was also trapped by his own desires. He had been obsessed with having a male heir for years, and Anne, in her own clever way, became the woman who could make that happen. But by the time Henry married Anne, his desperation for a male heir had grown to such an extent that he began to see their union as his last chance at securing his legacy. It wasn't just love that drove Henry, it was a fear of failure, a fear of dying without leaving a son to inherit the throne. In the end, Anne's courtship was not just about love, it was about power, ambition, and the pursuit of a destiny that would forever change England. She wasn't just the mistress of a king, she was the architect of her own rise to power. And while love may have played a role, it was Anne's deep understanding of the political game that truly made her a force to be reckoned with. Her relationship with Henry VIII was far from a fairy tale. It was the result of one of the most strategic and politically charged courtships in history, and that, more than anything, is what makes Anne Boleyn's story so compelling. How did Anne use her power to manipulate the English court and shape her legacy? Anne Boleyn was not just a queen by title. She was a woman who understood the intricacies of court politics better than most. Even though her time as queen was short-lived, her influence over the English court was undeniable. She didn't just accept her position, she wielded power with skill, even if it meant challenging the very foundations of the court. But what did Anne's influence look like? How did she manipulate the court to not only secure her position, but also shape the future of England? At the heart of Anne's influence was her keen understanding of the political game. She was raised in the courts of Europe, where she observed the rise and fall of powerful figures. By the time she returned to England and caught the eye of Henry VIII, Anne had mastered the art of courtly intrigue. She wasn't just another beautiful woman vying for the king's attention. She was someone who knew how to play the long game. Her ability to manipulate Henry VIII was legendary. The king was initially captivated by Anne's intellect, her charm, and, most importantly, her ability to challenge him in ways that other women could not. Anne wasn't afraid to confront Henry, to push him to act on his desires, but also to control his impulses. When Henry desired to marry her, Anne used his need for a male heir as leverage. She didn't become his mistress, as was expected. Instead, she demanded marriage. This bold move was strategic, not just for her own gain, but for the future of England. She knew that Henry's desire for a son would not only shape her own future, but the kingdom's as well. But here's the twist. Anne's power wasn't just derived from her relationship with Henry. She understood that the court was filled with factions, and the key to securing her influence was aligning herself with the right people. Anne was a master at using her position to elevate those loyal to her and diminish the power of her enemies. One of her closest allies, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, would eventually play a pivotal role in the establishment of the Church of England. Anne's ability to influence key figures in the court helped her secure her position and advance the Protestant cause. She didn't just control Henry, she influenced the course of England's religious future. It's often said that Anne Boleyn was a religious reformer, but this fact is more complicated than it seems. While she supported the Protestant cause, she was not a revolutionary in the sense that many later reformers were. Anne was not advocating for a complete overhaul of English society or religious doctrine. She was trying to carve out a space for reform within the existing power structures. Anne's support for reformers like Cranmer was strategic, not ideological. She understood that Henry's break from Rome, while driven by his desire for a male heir, also gave her an opportunity to influence England's future. Anne knew that if she played her cards right, she could secure not only her own legacy, but the legacy of her daughter, Elizabeth I, who would eventually become one of the greatest monarchs in history. Here's a strange and often overlooked fact. Anne's push for reform didn't make her universally popular. While the English court was filled with people who supported her, it was also home to many who resented her power. Some of Henry's closest advisors were deeply conservative and opposed Anne's influence. Thomas More, a key figure in Henry's court and a staunch Catholic, saw Anne as a dangerous threat to the established order. Anne's rise was seen by some as a challenge to the traditional power structures, and as a result, she made many enemies who were more than willing to plot against her. But how did Anne keep her enemies at bay? She used her influence to elevate those loyal to her and undermine her rivals. One of her most significant moves was securing the promotion of reformers within the church, individuals who would later be instrumental in the creation of the Church of England. Anne's political maneuvering helped to shift the balance of power at court in her favor. She wasn't just a passive player in Henry's court, she was an active participant in shaping the future of England. Yet this very influence also sowed the seeds of her downfall. Anne's rise to power made her enemies, and as her influence grew, so did the number of people who wanted to see her removed. Anne had created a system where only those loyal to her could survive, and when her political fortunes began to wane, so did the loyalty of those who had once been by her side. The same allies who had helped Anne secure her throne were now part of a court that was turning against her. The people who had once supported her religious reforms and her political power now found themselves backing other factions. This shift in loyalty was key to Anne's eventual fall. Here's the controversial truth. Anne's downfall was as much a result of her political strategies as it was her inability to produce a male heir. While it's true that Anne's failure to provide a son played a significant role in her decline, her real vulnerability lay in the way she had manipulated the court. The very same power structures that had helped her rise to the throne were the ones that turned against her when her influence began to wane. Anne's courtly manipulations, while brilliant, ultimately became her undoing. Here's a fact that might surprise you. Anne's downfall wasn't just about her inability to produce a son or the political machinations of her enemy. It was also about the fact that Anne's rise had completely upended the power dynamic dynamics within the court. She had made so many enemies by challenging the old order that her eventual fall was inevitable. The political alliances that had once supported her were fragile and easily broken when Henry's desires shifted. In the end, Anne Boleyn's time in power was a complicated dance of manipulation, loyalty, and political strategy. She wasn't just a passive queen. She was an active player in shaping the course of England's future. But her story is also a reminder of the dangers of playing the political game in a world where loyalties can change in an instant, and the very alliances that once made you powerful can just as easily lead to your downfall. As we look back on Anne's influence in the court, we see a woman who knew how to navigate the treacherous waters of Tudor politics, who used her intelligence and ambition to rise to the top, and who ultimately paid the price for her boldness. Anne's legacy is a testament to the power of political maneuvering, but also a cautionary tale of the dangers of playing too many cards at once. What happened when Henry VIII's feelings for Anne began to waver? At the start of their relationship, Henry VIII was utterly captivated by Anne Boleyn. She was the obsession that replaced his long, unhappy marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Henry's feelings for Anne were intense. He was determined to make her his queen, no matter the cost. But as time went on, his feelings began to shift, and the once passionate love affair that defined Anne's rise to power started to show cracks. So, what happened? Why did Henry's feelings for Anne, which had once burned so brightly, begin to wane? It wasn't love that kept their marriage intact. It was the relentless pressure to have a son. Henry's desperation for a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty was the driving force behind his marriage to Anne. He had spent years trying to produce a male heir with Catherine, but after the birth of their daughter Mary, he grew increasingly frustrated with his inability to have a son. Enter Anne, who promised to deliver the heir he so desperately wanted. Despite her ambition and determination, Anne failed to give Henry the male heir he envisioned, and it was this failure, more than anything, that began to unravel their relationship. The pressure on Anne was immense. Every misstep in producing a male heir was not just a personal failure, it was seen as a failure to the kingdom itself. As months turned into years, Anne suffered multiple miscarriages, and with each one, the weight of her inability to fulfill Henry's desires grew heavier. Anne's rivals, including Jane Seymour, who was everything Anne wasn't, docile, demure, and obedient, began to rise in Henry's eyes. Anne, once the queen of his heart, started to become a reminder of everything he couldn't have: a strong, secure male heir. Henry's growing frustration with Anne was palpable, and as time passed, his feelings cooled. Here's the strange part. Despite Anne's failure to produce a son, Henry's obsession with the idea of an heir only intensified. Anne's inability to give him the son he craved became a symbol of his own perceived failure. But what's even more fascinating is that Henry's obsession with a male heir wasn't just about his legacy, it was about control. As a king, Henry's power and his sense of identity were tied to the belief that he could control his destiny, and that included controlling the succession. Without a male heir, Henry's own kingship would be uncertain, and this, more than Anne's personality or charm, led to his eventual abandonment of her. But what makes this part of Anne's story even more intriguing is that it was not just Anne's inability to bear a son that caused her fall. Her entire role had been shaped by her capacity to provide that heir. Anne had been the catalyst for Henry's break with the Catholic Church, but once he married her and failed to have the desired son, the very political and religious shifts she had championed seemed less important to him. Her role as the woman who gave him a kingdom through the dissolution of the monasteries and the creation of the Church of England was overshadowed by her failure to give him a male child. Henry needed a reason to abandon her, and her miscarriages gave him the perfect excuse. It's a bitter irony. Anne had given Henry what he wanted in terms of power and influence, but when it came to securing his legacy through a son, she fell short. This leads us to an uncomfortable truth. Anne's fate was sealed not just by her personal failures, but by the impossible expectations placed on her. Henry's desire for an heir created a trap that Anne could never escape. But here's the controversial point. Henry wasn't entirely blameless in this saga. While Anne's failure to produce a son was a legitimate concern, Henry's obsession with this one goal led him to overlook other potential solutions. Some historians argue that Anne's miscarriages were the result of Henry's own health problems, which could have impacted her ability to carry a child to term. But instead of acknowledging this, Henry allowed his fixation on the male heir to dominate every aspect of his relationship with Anne. Now let's dive deeper into Henry's change of heart. What did it mean for Anne when Henry's obsession with producing a son became an ever-growing frustration? Henry's attention began to shift toward Jane Seymour, a woman who could offer him what he thought he needed: a male heir. Henry's growing infatuation with Jane Seymour didn't just signal his shift in affections, it also symbolized the beginning of Anne's downfall. As Jane's influence grew, Anne's faded. In fact, Jane Seymour's very presence in Henry's life made Anne more and more irrelevant, and she realized the harsh reality. She was no longer the answer to Henry's problems. Here's a rare and little-known fact. At the time of Anne's downfall, her relationship with Henry was so strained that, in a strange twist, Anne had reportedly asked for Henry's forgiveness. She seemed to realize that her position was slipping, and perhaps, just perhaps, that a reconciliation with the king could save her life. But by then, it was too late. The wheels of her downfall were already in motion, and the king's affection for her had turned cold. As Anne's rivals, like Jane Seymour, grew in prominence, she found herself increasingly isolated. The court was turning against her, and the loyalty loyalty of those around her was beginning to waver. Anne had made too many enemies, and as her marriage to Henry crumbled, those enemies saw an opportunity to bring her down. Henry's attention shifted, and his need for an heir became an obsession that he could not escape. But by the time Anne realized that her role in his life was no longer secure, it was far too late to reverse the damage. The tragedy of Anne's fall is that she was caught in a system of expectations she could never meet. No matter how ambitious or intelligent she was, no matter how much influence she had, her failure to bear a male heir overshadowed everything else. In the end, Anne's fate wasn't determined by her love for Henry or her political acumen. It was determined by Henry's unyielding desire for a son. The story of Anne Boleyn's change of fortune is a reminder of how easily power can shift and how impossible it can be for a woman to navigate the expectations of a patriarchal monarchy. The real tragedy of Anne's story lies not in the love affair that sparked her rise, but in the way it ultimately led to her downfall. Yes, a queen once adored, she found herself abandoned, a victim of impossible expectations and the relentless desire for a male heir. The weight of Henry's frustrations and the pressure of royal duty became too much for Anne to bear, and the love that had once driven her to the throne faded into a bitter memory of lost hopes. 9. Was Anne just a pawn in Henry's religious revolution, or did she play a critical role in shaping England's new identity? When you think of Anne Boleyn, it's easy to picture her as nothing more than a pawn in Henry VIII's grand religious experiment. But if you take a closer look at her life, you'll see that she wasn't just along for the ride. Anne was much more than just a queen with political ambitions. She was a key player in one of the most significant revolutions in England's history, the Protestant Reformation. Anne's relationship with Henry started with an affair that eventually led to her becoming queen. But what if I told you her rise to the throne wasn't just about winning the king's heart? It was about something much larger, the creation of the Church of England and the dismantling of Catholic rule in the country. Anne was more than just the woman who captured Henry's affection. She was a driving force behind the religious revolution that would forever change the course of English history. And the seeds for this change were planted long before Henry's desire for her became a matter of public scandal. Before she ever caught Henry's eye, Anne spent her early life at the courts of Europe. As a young woman, she gained exposure to the religious and political ideas that were shaking the foundations of Christendom. She had first-hand experience with the reformist ideas emerging from places like the Netherlands and France, where scholars like Erasmus and reformers like Martin Luther were challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. Anne was exposed to these radical thoughts early on, and it's likely that her time in Europe shaped her thinking about religion and the church. When she arrived back in England, she wasn't just a noble woman with beauty and charm. She was a woman with ideas that were ahead of her time. Now, it might surprise you to learn that Anne didn't just play the role of the seductress who won Henry's heart. She played an active part in Henry's break from Rome. Henry's quest for a divorce from Catherine of Aragon wasn't just driven by his love for Anne. As many history books suggest, there was a much bigger issue at stake: Henry's desire to have a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. But Anne, like no other, understood the political and religious implications of her position. She wasn't content to just be a mistress. She saw an opportunity to reshape England's religious landscape. Anne had the foresight to understand that if she became queen, she could help foster the Protestant movement in England. She used her position to influence Henry, encouraging him to seek a break from the Catholic Church's authority. Her personal beliefs and her political ambitions aligned, and together they led to the establishment of the Church of England. Henry's Act of Supremacy in 1534, which declared him the supreme head of the Church of England, was as much Anne's victory as it was Henry's. Without Anne, it's possible that Henry would have never made such a radical move. Anne's influence didn't stop with Henry. She encouraged the spread of Protestant ideas throughout the English court, where many of the key players, like Thomas Cranmer, were sympathetic to reformist ideas. It was Anne's patronage that allowed these ideas to take root. In fact, it's largely thanks to Anne that some of the first English translations of the Bible began to circulate. This wasn't just about religion, it was about power. By fostering the Protestant movement, Anne was shifting the balance of power away from Rome and into the hands of the monarchy. But, as you might expect, her support of the Protestant cause came at a high cost. Not everyone in England, especially among the Catholic faction, was thrilled about Anne's influence. Her support of reformers made her a target of Catholic and conservative factions at court. As Henry's feelings for Anne began to cool, those enemies who had long resented her began to use her political and religious influence as ammunition against her. Her fall from favor was closely tied to her religious influence, and it wasn't long before her opponents, both political and religious, saw her as a threat to their power. The very reforms that Anne championed eventually became her undoing, and the political upheaval she helped ignite turned into a fire that consumed her. The most shocking part of Anne's involvement in the Reformation is that, despite her early and critical role in shaping England's religious identity, her efforts ultimately outlived her reign. Even though Anne was executed, her daughter Elizabeth would go on to be one of the most powerful monarchs in history, and her reign was a shining example of Protestant success in England. The Protestant Reformation, which Anne had supported, reshaped not only the church but also the political landscape of England, giving rise to a religious and political identity that would last for centuries. Now, here's the controversial truth: Anne may have been a victim of her own success. Her very involvement in the Reformation made her a target for both the old Catholic establishment and her political enemies. Her downfall didn't just stem from her inability to give Henry a male heir, it was also about the power she wielded. It's ironic, isn't it? Anne, the woman who helped change the course of English history, was eventually taken down by the very power she had helped create. There's another little-known fact about Anne's role in the religious upheaval of England. Did you know that Anne also played a key part in the spread of humanist ideas in the English court? Humanism, a philosophical movement that sought to revive classical learning and values, was closely associated with the Reformation. Anne's exposure to these ideas in Europe gave her the intellectual foundation to challenge the Catholic Church's authority and align herself with reformers who wanted to reshape the theological and political structures of the time. Anne's legacy, despite the tragic end to her life, was incredibly powerful. Her direct involvement in Henry's break with Rome laid the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation in England. Aftermath of her death, Elizabeth would go on to solidify the changes Anne helped initiate, leading England into an era where Protestantism was the dominant religion, and the monarch's power was more consolidated than ever. Anne Boleyn's role in the Reformation wasn't just about her relationship with Henry, it was about her vision of a new England, one that could stand apart from the Catholic Church and assert its independence. Anne wasn't just a pawn, she was a revolutionary, and her influence, though cut short by her death, helped shape the future of England for generations to come. Did Anne's multiple miscarriages seal her fate, or was there more to her downfall? Her ability to provide a male heir to Henry VIII became a turning point in her life and a catalyst for her ultimate downfall. But while this might seem like the key reason for her tragic end, the truth is far more complex. The pressure Anne faced to bear a son wasn't merely a personal failure, it was a political nightmare that had consequences far beyond her reign. Each miscarriage didn't just mark a personal tragedy for Anne, it shifted her position at court, weakened her power, and fueled Henry's growing dissatisfaction with her. The combination of these failures with her already precarious political situation would soon lead to a public and brutal downfall that changed the course of England's history. Anne's first miscarriage was a devastating blow. It wasn't just the loss of a child, it was a loss of the future she and Henry had envisioned together. She had promised him a son, the male heir that England so desperately needed, but instead she suffered a miscarriage that left her physically and emotionally shattered. The court's reaction was swift, and the pressure on Anne to produce an heir became unbearable. The eyes of the entire kingdom were upon her, and every failure to produce a son was seen as a failure in her duty as queen. This wasn't just about personal grief, it was about political survival. While Anne may have seen herself as more than just a vessel for producing heirs, Henry was fixated on the idea of securing the Tudor dynasty through a male heir. His obsession with a son overshadowed everything else, and as Anne's miscarriages piled up, so did his frustration. Anne's inability to produce a male heir wasn't just a private disappointment, it was becoming an obstacle to Henry's goals. The more Anne failed, the more his desire for a son consumed him. The relationship that had once been based on love and ambition began to wither, replaced by an intense and growing dissatisfaction. Her political maneuvering and the positions she had taken made her enemies in the court who were ready to exploit any sign of weakness. Anne's rise had been controversial, and she had made powerful enemies, many of whom were waiting for an opportunity to strike. Her inability to provide a son was just the beginning. Her miscarriages became a symbol of failure in the eyes of her enemies, and were used as ammunition in the growing plot against her. The pressure from her rivals to remove her from power escalated. At the same time, the whispers in the court grew louder. Anne was no longer seen as the queen who had once held Henry's heart, but as a woman whose worth was defined by her inability to bear the future king of England. Each miscarriage wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political failure. The court began to turn against her as Henry's frustration with her grew. The lack of a male heir made Anne a liability, and she became less of an ally and more of a pawn in a larger political game. Her failures at producing a male heir weakened her position, not only in Henry's eyes but in the eyes of the entire court. The atmosphere turned hostile, and even those who had once supported her began to distance themselves. The once favored queen became a target for anyone looking to undermine her, and Anne's power began to unravel. It wasn't just Anne's inability to produce a son that marked the end of her reign, it was the perception that she had failed in her most important duty. In an age when women's worth was often tied to their ability to bear heirs, Anne's inability to produce a male heir was viewed as a betrayal. But was it truly her fault? The question of whether Anne's miscarriages were the result of her own body's failures, or were they caused by Henry's own health issues, which were never fully addressed, remains one of the many mysteries of her story. Historians have long speculated about whether Henry's health played a role in the lack of a male heir, but the pressure on Anne was unwavering, and the blame for failure was always laid squarely at her feet. What makes Anne's situation even more tragic is the fact that her miscarriages were only part of a much larger story. She wasn't just fighting against the biological realities of childbirth, she was fighting against a system that demanded perfection and saw anything less as a failure. Her ability to produce a male heir was a direct reflection of her political power, and when that failed, so did she. But here's the twist. Even though Anne's reign as queen was cut short, her failure to produce a male heir was, ironically, one of the key factors that allowed her legacy to live on. Her, Elizabeth, would become one of England's greatest monarchs, and in that sense, Anne's inability to bear a male heir led to the rise of one of the most powerful women in history. By the time Anne's final miscarriage occurred, her position was irreparably weakened. The pressure on her from Henry and her enemies had reached a breaking point. The miscarriage was the final straw in a long series of personal and political failures, and it sealed Anne's fate. The miscarriage wasn't just a loss, it was the beginning of the end. Her enemies, who had been waiting for a sign of weakness, seized the opportunity to take her down, and the political game in the court became more treacherous by the day. Anne's fall was swift, and within months, she was arrested on charges that were largely fabricated, and her life would soon be tragically cut short. Anne Boleyn's multiple miscarriages played a pivotal role in her downfall, but they were not the sole reason for her tragic end. The miscarriages were a symbol of her failure in the eyes of the court, and they fueled the political fires that would eventually consume her. Her story serves as a powerful reminder of how fragile power can be, especially when it's tied to the ability to produce a male heir. The pressure on women in Anne's time was immense, and her inability to fulfill that role ultimately made her a victim of the very system she sought to challenge. The legacy of Anne Boleyn's miscarriages is complex. On the one hand, they were seen as her personal failure. On the other hand, they were a tragic consequence of a system that failed to recognize a woman's worth beyond her reproductive ability. Her ultimate fate, driven by this pressure, was tragic, but it also set the stage for a new era in England, where her daughter Elizabeth would rise to power and change the course of history. What were the real reasons behind Anne's arrest, and how much of it was political conspiracy? Anne Boleyn's arrest was a monumental event in English history, but to understand the full scope of what led to it, we need to unravel a series of tangled motivations. The official charges, adultery, incest, and treason, were serious, but were they truly grounded in reality? Or was this an elaborate political scheme designed to remove her from power? Anne Boleyn was no stranger to political rivalry. She had made plenty of enemies during her rise to power, and by the time her arrest occurred, her influence at court was becoming a serious threat to those who held power in Henry VIII's court. Chief among her adversaries was Thomas Cromwell, a man who had initially been one of her strongest supporters, but later became one of the key figures behind her downfall. Cromwell's ambition and his role in orchestrating Henry's break with Rome put him in a precarious position. Anne, pushing for reforms and aligning herself with Protestant ideas, Cromwell saw her as a growing threat to the establishment he had worked so hard to build. The catalyst for Anne's downfall was her inability to produce a male heir. As much as Henry VIII had fallen in love with Anne during their courtship, his obsession with securing the Tudor dynasty through a son eventually overshadowed any affection he might have had for her. When Anne suffered a series of miscarriages and failed to provide Henry with the desired male heir, the cracks in their relationship began to deepen. Henry's frustration was compounded by the rise of Anne's rivals at court, most notably Jane Seymour, who embodied the hope of producing the longed-for son. And by 1536, Anne's political standing had significantly weakened, and her enemies began to see this as the perfect opportunity to strike. The charges against Anne were constructed on flimsy evidence. In fact, many historians argue that the accusations were fabricated or exaggerated. The charge of adultery, for instance, was largely based on the testimonies of men who had been coerced into giving false confession. Anne's alleged lovers, including her own brother George Boleyn, were accused of being part of a conspiracy to overthrow the king. The evidence against Anne was laughable by modern standards. There was no physical proof of the alleged incest or adultery, and much of the testimony came from individuals who had been pressured to implicate her. But the real question is, why would Henry go along with such a clear injustice? The answer lies in his growing disillusionment with Anne, mixed with his desperate desire for a male heir. By the time the charges were brought against Anne, Henry was already looking for a way out of his marriage. The stakes were incredibly high. If Anne could not produce the son he so desperately needed, the future of the Tudor dynasty could be in jeopardy. Anne's failure to provide a male heir had become a threat to Henry's legacy, and removing her from the throne seemed like the only solution. It wasn't just about personal betrayal, it was about political survival. Even though Anne's arrest was initially framed as a scandalous betrayal of the king, it quickly became clear that the charges were part of a well-orchestrated political move. The trial that followed was a farce, a public spectacle designed to secure Anne's conviction. The court was stacked against her from the beginning, and the outcome was never in doubt. It's almost as though the verdict was preordained. The trial itself was a tragic reflection of how power could be wielded to destroy anyone who stood in its way, regardless of their innocence. What makes this whole situation even more tragic is that Anne, who had once been the darling of the court, had become the target of a coordinated campaign to strip her of everything she had worked so hard to achieve. Her enemies, both political and personal, saw her fall from grace as an opportunity to reshape the court and realign power in favor of those who would follow Henry's wishes. Anne's arrest marked the end of her reign, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in English politics, one where personal vendettas, power struggles, and the desire for control over the throne would dominate. One of the most disturbing aspects of Anne's arrest was the role of her own family in her downfall. It wasn't just Anne who suffered as a result of these charges. Her brother, George Boleyn, was also arrested and executed on charges of incest with his sister. The Boleyn family, which had once been at the very heart of the English court, was torn apart. The tragedy of Anne's arrest and execution didn't just impact her, it left deep scars on her family, and their fall from grace sent a chilling message to those who might dare to challenge the established order. And the charges against her highlight a critical point in the history of the Tudor monarchy, the extent to which power was wielded for personal gain. Henry's desperate need for a male heir drove him to disregard justice in favor of political expediency. His desire for control, both over his dynasty and his court, led him to sacrifice Anne, a woman he had once loved, in the most brutal way possible. The court's willingness to embrace false charges against Anne reflects how far some individuals would go to consolidate their own power. As Anne faced her fate, her trial and execution became symbols of the dangers of unchecked political power. The public spectacle of her downfall served as a reminder that the lives of individuals were expendable when it came to securing the future of the monarchy. But Anne's death didn't just mark the end of her story, it set the stage for the rise of her daughter, Elizabeth I, whose reign would go on to change the course of English history. Political machinations that led to Anne's arrest ultimately paved the way for the rise of a queen who would solidify England's place on the world stage. In the end, Anne Boleyn's arrest and execution were not just the tragic result of personal betrayal, but were deeply rooted in the political dynamics of her time. Her fall was orchestrated by those who stood to gain from her demise, and her charges were nothing more than a convenient excuse to rid the court of a woman who had become a threat to the established order. What were the real reasons behind Anne's arrest, and how much of it was political conspiracy? Anne Boleyn's arrest wasn't just a case of personal betrayal or a simple scandal. It was a carefully orchestrated move that had political implications far beyond her relationship with Henry VIII. The charges levied against her, adultery, treason, and incest, shocked England, but the real story behind them is far more complex. Let's dive deeper into the political atmosphere of the time. Anne, having been the woman who had once captured Henry's heart, had now become a target. They had managed to achieve something truly remarkable. She had elevated herself from the role of a mistress to that of queen, a position of power that no one expected her to reach. However, in doing so, she made enemies, powerful enemies, who began to view her as a threat to their own influence. One of her most powerful enemies was Thomas Cromwell, a key advisor to Henry. In the early years of Anne's reign, Cromwell had worked closely with her to secure Henry's break with the Catholic Church, which ultimately led to England's creation of its own Protestant Church. However, as time passed, Cromwell's position began to falter. His political agenda clashed with Anne's increasing influence, and he began to fear that she was becoming too powerful, too uncontrollable. If Anne were to continue to push forward with her Protestant reforms, Cromwell, a staunch political strategist, saw his own power slipping away. He needed a way to eliminate her, and an accusation of treason was the perfect solution. But there's a twist in this tale. Henry, who had once adored Anne, was beginning to lose his patience. His desire for a male heir, a son who could solidify the Tudor dynasty, had become an obsession. Anne had failed to produce a son after several years of marriage, and her miscarriage of a male child in 1536 only added to the mounting pressure on her. It's said that Henry, frustrated by his wife's inability to fulfill his dynastic needs, began to look elsewhere for a new queen, a woman who could provide the heir he so desperately craved. The problem, however, was that Anne had provided him with no real political leverage beyond her marriage. She had no male heir, and now her enemies had the perfect opportunity to accuse her of failing in her queenly duties. The charge of adultery was a convenient excuse for Henry to rid himself of Anne. The testimonies of several men, some of whom were coerced or tortured into giving false confessions, served as evidence of Anne's supposed betrayal of her marriage vows. Among those accused were men close to the queen, including her own brother, George Boleyn. These charges of incest were not only scandalous but also shocking to the English court. The charges were so outrageous that they were hard to believe, yet Anne's enemies used them to build a case against her. The evidence, or lack thereof, against Anne was so thin that many historians today argue the charges were fabricated to remove her from power. She was not given a fair trial. Her defense was feeble, and the court stacked against her was designed to ensure her downfall. Those closest to Henry, those who stood to gain from Anne's demise, wielded their power to ensure that the verdict would be guilty regardless of the truth. The trial was less about justice and more about power. Anne had become the embodiment of everything Henry VIII's enemies feared, a woman who could not only shape England's religious landscape, but who could also defy their political control. The fear was that if Anne were allowed to continue in her position, the balance of power in the court would shift irreversibly. She had already challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, and her Protestant views were not just unpopular among the conservatives, but also alarming to many in the court who feared further instability. The decision to eliminate Anne was not one made in the heat of passion. It was a cold, calculated move to secure the future of Henry's reign and the Tudor dynasty. But how much of Anne's fate was truly in Henry's hands? Although he had become disillusioned with her, the truth is that Anne's arrest was as much about the power struggle within the English court as it was about her marriage. The rise of Jane Seymour, who represented everything Anne could not give Henry, a male heir, was the final nail in Anne's coffin. While Anne had once been the woman who captivated Henry, Jane's quiet demeanor and fertility became the qualities that Henry needed to stabilize his rule. In the political chess game that was Tudor England, Anne's removal was the key to securing Henry's future and appeasing his court. Anne's arrest marked the beginning of her very public fall from grace, but it was not simply the result of personal betrayal. It was part of a much larger struggle for power that ultimately ultimately culminated in her tragic end. Her enemies, who had long plotted her downfall, finally succeeded in dismantling her influence. The charges against her, though false and fabricated, served as a way to remove a woman who had become far too powerful for the comfort of those who governed England. In the end, Anne Boleyn's story is a stark reminder of how power operates behind the scenes. Her arrest wasn't just the story of a woman caught in a scandal. It was the tragic consequence of a political maneuver designed to protect the interests of the powerful. It was the fall of a queen, but also the machinations of a court that used its influence to reshape England's future. Anne's arrest and execution were as much about power, politics, and control as they were about her personal life, and this is a crucial aspect that history often overlooks. Anne's downfall was ultimately not her inability to produce a male heir, nor her political ambitions. It was the ruthless manipulation of the very systems that had once elevated her to the throne. The Tudor court, rife with political intrigue and power struggles, had condemned her before she even stood trial. The tragedy of Anne's story isn't just in her death, but in how easily the wheels of power can turn, pushing aside anyone who stands in its way. How could Anne's trial have been so unjust, and why was the outcome already decided? Anne Boleyn's trial was a shocking miscarriage of justice, a public spectacle where the outcome had been determined before it even began. Her trial wasn't the result of a fair legal proceeding. It was a meticulously orchestrated event to remove a woman who had become far too powerful for the men who feared her. But how could a Queen of England be subjected to such an unfair trial? And let's step back for a moment and take in the political climate of the time. Anne's reign, though short, had stirred up immense tensions within the court. Her marriage to Henry VIII had not only led to a break with the Catholic Church, but it also pushed England into the Protestant Reformation. Anne was seen by many as the queen who sparked a radical shift in the nation's religious landscape. To some, she was a symbol of innovation. To others, she was a threat to the established order. But power struggles were brewing beneath the surface. Henry, once infatuated with Anne, had begun to lose patience. His obsession with securing a male heir had reached a fever pitch, and Anne's failure to deliver a son had put immense pressure on her position. It was no longer just a matter of marital discord. It was about power, control, and the future of the Tudor dynasty. And then there were her enemies. Thomas Cromwell, who had once been an ally, now viewed Anne as a liability. Cromwell had been instrumental in securing the break from Rome, but as Anne's influence grew, his own power started to wane. A woman in his way could not be tolerated. Cromwell, knowing that Anne had fallen out of favor with Henry, saw an opportunity to remove her. He knew that if he could frame Anne as a threat to the throne, someone who had committed adultery and even incest, he could destroy her once and for all. The charges against Anne were as serious as they were fabricated. She was accused of adultery, treason, and incest. But let's think about this. How could a woman in Anne's position, who was constantly under surveillance, have committed such acts without anyone noticing? How could a queen, someone at the very top of the social ladder, be accused of sleeping with multiple men and conspiring to kill her husband? The truth is that the evidence against Anne was flimsy at best, and in many cases, it was outright fabricated. Witnesses were tortured into giving false confessions, and Anne's enemies were more than willing to say whatever they needed to secure her downfall. George Boleyn, Anne's brother, was one of the key witnesses who allegedly confessed to committing incest with her. This confession, obtained under duress, was used as key evidence in the trial, and yet no physical evidence, no letters, no undeniable proof was presented to substantiate the charges. The trial itself was a farce. The deck was so stacked against her that even her defense lawyer was working for the prosecution. The trial wasn't about uncovering the truth. It was about ensuring that Anne was convicted. Her fate had already been sealed. Anne was accused of crimes that were virtually impossible to prove, and even though she denied all charges, the trial proceeded with no genuine effort to seek justice. But what was the real purpose behind all of this? Anne Boleyn had become a political pawn, a scapegoat for the frustrations and ambitions of the men who surrounded her. She was guilty of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, having failed to provide Henry with the son he desperately wanted. Her political enemies needed to neutralize her before she could push forward with her reforms and continue to wield the power she had as queen. Trial, in many ways, was not just a trial of Anne's actions. It was a trial of the political order in Tudor England. It was an attempt to remove a woman who had not only disrupted the religious status quo, but who had also challenged the male-dominated political system. Anne had outlived her usefulness to Henry, and her execution was seen as a way to restore the balance of power. The trial marked the end of Anne's reign, but it was also a significant turning point for the Tudor dynasty. In the aftermath, Anne's execution set a dangerous precedent for future political trials in England. Her death was an example of how power could manipulate justice. It didn't matter if Anne was guilty or innocent. What mattered was the narrative that the court wanted to create. Anne's execution wasn't a matter of law, it was a matter of control. The real injustice wasn't just in the way Anne was treated in court, but in the way her life was used as a tool to maintain the power structures of the time. She was made an example of, and her death served to reinforce the notion that, in Tudor England, the fate of the powerful could be sealed with the stroke of a pen, no matter the truth. Anne's trial wasn't just a public spectacle, it was a demonstration of how easily the truth could be manipulated by those in power. It showed the lengths to which political leaders would go to maintain control and preserve their hold on the throne. The trial trial in many ways was a reflection of the corruption at the heart of the Tudor court, where power wasn't determined by the law or fairness. It was determined by loyalty, manipulation, and the desire to hold on to power at any cost. The real question we must ask ourselves today is, how much of Anne's downfall was truly her fault, and how much of it was simply a product of the dangerous politics of her time? Anne Boleyn was the victim of a corrupt system, and her trial was nothing more than a formality to ensure that her influence would be erased from the history books. What does Anne's trial teach us? It reminds us that in times of political instability, those who hold power will stop at nothing to protect their interests, even at the expense of justice. Anne's story serves as a warning. The truth is often the first casualty in a struggle for power. How did Anne Boleyn's life and death change the course of England's history in ways you might not expect? Anne Boleyn, the woman who ascended from royal mistress to Queen of England, was not just a figure in Henry VIII's tumultuous life. Her role in shaping England's history went far beyond her marriage to Henry and her tragic end. At the time of her rise, the stakes were incredibly high. A monarchy desperate for stability, a country teetering on the edge of religious and political upheaval. Anne's decisions, actions, and even her death influenced the course of history in unexpected ways. But let's take a moment and think about what Anne's death truly meant for the kingdom. Most people think her execution was a mere consequence of her inability to provide a male heir, but the reality is far more complex, and it's woven deeply into the fabric of England's future. Her daughter, Elizabeth I, would go on to become one of the most powerful monarchs in history. Imagine that for a second. Anne, who had been executed in one of the most public and politically charged trials of the era, gave birth to a queen who would redefine England and its place in the world. Elizabeth's reign ushered in an era of prosperity and power, an era that would lay the foundation for the British Empire. Anne's execution, though tragic, acted as a catalyst for the consolidation of power within the Tudor dynasty. It was an unfortunate chapter in a narrative of royal conflict that fueled the rise of her daughter Elizabeth. Had Anne not been executed, there would have been no need for Elizabeth to eventually step up as England's sovereign. Her accession to the throne, however, was built on the ruins of Anne's demise. Now let's talk about the Protestant Reformation. Most people know Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church to marry Anne, but the true depth of Anne's involvement in this seismic shift is often overlooked. It was Anne who was not just a catalyst, but a supporter of the Protestant cause, and she actively promoted ideas that would later form the backbone of English Protestantism. Her influence on Henry VIII was critical in his decision to make England a Protestant nation, despite the heavy pushback from Catholic Europe. Anne herself was an advocate for reformers like Thomas Cranmer, who played a key role in the religious transformations of the time. By embracing Protestantism, Anne set England on a path that would define its religious landscape for centuries. Her support for the English translation of the Bible, for example, was revolutionary. She didn't just usher in a new dynasty, she helped to reshape England's entire religious identity. That transformation laid the groundwork for the English Civil War, the rise of Puritanism, and the eventual establishment of a religiously diverse England. But there's another part of Anne's legacy that few people talk about: her influence on English court culture. Before Anne, English court culture was steeped in the medieval traditions of chivalry, Catholicism, and dynastic marriages. Anne, however, brought a new energy to the court. She infused it with a sense of Renaissance learning, humanism, and an intellectual curiosity that had been absent in Henry's previous queens. Anne Boleyn represented a new kind of woman. She wasn't content to sit quietly by her husband's side. She was politically savvy and ambitious, challenging the established norms and taking an active role in shaping her kingdom. In doing so, she changed the way women would be viewed at court. Anne set a precedent for future queens and women of power. It was her example, for better or worse, that would inspire future generations of women like Elizabeth, who wielded power in their own right. Let's not forget that Anne's execution marked a dangerous precedent. It wasn't just the end of Anne's reign. It was the beginning of a new political landscape, one where the fates of women at the top of the social ladder could be decided by the whims of men. Anne's downfall and her dramatic fall from grace revealed the fragility of power in Tudor England. Her execution, carried out with the consent of her own husband, sent a message about the volatility of life in the royal court. In Anne's case, power wasn't permanent. It could be taken away in an instant, and no one, not even a queen, was beyond the reach of the king's dissatisfaction. What most people don't realize is that Anne's story, though tragic, is filled with lessons on power, ambition, and the vulnerability of those who dare to challenge the established order. She was not just a queen or a victim of political machinations. She was a symbol of the precariousness of power, especially for women. Her life shows us how history is shaped by the collision of ambition, politics, and gender. The question remains, could Anne have succeeded had she given Henry a male heir? Most people would say yes, but the truth is more nuanced. The pressures on Anne were immense, and the political landscape was shifting under her feet. Her fall wasn't inevitable because she failed to produce a son. It was inevitable because she became a pawn in a larger game of power, a game in which her enemies were playing for keeps. In the end, Anne's legacy is complex. She is remembered as both a tragic figure and a revolutionary one. Her death marked the end of an era and the beginning of another, one in which the power of monarchs would be tested, and one in which the role of women at the center of power would never again be quite the same. Anne Boleyn didn't just change the course of England's history. She reshaped the very notion of power in England. Through her rise, her reign, and her death, Anne's influence echoes throughout history. How did Anne Boleyn's death affect the Tudor dynasty, and what does it say about the power struggles of the times? Anne Boleyn's death did more than simply remove a queen from the throne. She became the pivotal point that solidified the Tudor dynasty in a way that no one could have predicted. Her execution was a harsh reminder of how fragile life could be for a royal, especially for a queen who had been caught in a web of political intrigue and personal ambition. Thus, here's something many people don't know. Anne's death wasn't just about her failing to provide a male heir or her falling out of favor with Henry VIII. It was a powerful moment that reverberated through the entire monarchy and the nation. Anne's demise was intricately tied to the shifting power dynamics within the Tudor court, but her death would unexpectedly strengthen the monarchy she left behind. Let's break this down. At the time of Anne's execution, the Tudor dynasty was still relatively young. Henry VIII had been king for decades, but the crown's legitimacy had always been questioned, especially in the eyes of those who favored Catholicism and the old ways of ruling. Anne, with her Protestant leanings and her role in Henry's break with the Church of Rome, had made enemies, but her death, meticulously orchestrated by her political rivals, sealed her family's fate. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would inherit the throne after Henry's death and become one of the most powerful monarchs in history. Elizabeth's rise to the throne was not inevitable, but Anne's death created the political conditions for it. Henry VIII's frustrations with Anne and his desperate need for a male heir led to a series of events that would ultimately empower Elizabeth. Anne's fall, though tragic, cleared the path for Elizabeth to emerge as a formidable ruler, unchallenged by the same pressures that had plagued her mother. Anne's death was not just a moment of political convenience for Henry, it was also the beginning of a period of deep personal and political struggles for the monarchy. The fallout from her execution was immense, and it fundamentally altered the course of English history. It forced Henry to marry again and again in search of a son, but those marriages too contributed to the Tudor dynasty's growing instability. Yet strangely enough, Anne's execution in many ways ensured that Elizabeth would rule for a long and prosperous reign. But there's a darker side to this too. Anne's tragic death revealed how easily power could shift in the Tudor court. The people who orchestrated her downfall, Thomas Cromwell and others, knew that her death would allow them to take control. What many don't realize is that Anne's execution was not merely the result of a failed marriage, but also the consequence of an intricate and brutal game of power that was being played by the very people who once supported her. Her death was a political maneuver disguised as a moral judgment. Henry's decision to execute Anne was not only about personal failure or the politics of succession, it was also about the balance of power at the time. By removing Anne, Henry secured his position at the top of the political hierarchy, but it also paved the way for a new, more powerful dynasty, one that would be shaped by Anne's own daughter. The Tudor dynasty, as a result, became much stronger after Anne's death because Elizabeth's rule cemented the Tudor line, something no one had anticipated at the time. Anne's death was a turning point for the Tudor dynasty in ways that are still felt today. It's a reminder of the precariousness of royal life, especially in a time where succession was everything and personal ambition could determine a family's fate. The ripple effect of Anne's execution influenced the political and religious landscape for years to come, altering the course of England's history forever. The most remarkable thing about Anne's death is how it shaped the future of women in power. While Anne's rise to power was unconventional, her fall paved the way for Elizabeth I, one of the greatest female monarchs in history. Elizabeth's reign would establish England as a dominant force in Europe, and her legacy continues to impact how we view female rulers today. What Anne started, Elizabeth perfected. But without Anne's death, Elizabeth might never have risen to the throne, or at least not in the same way. Anne's tragic end is still one of the most talked about moments in English history, but it's important to remember the deeper consequences of her death. It was not just the end of a queen, it was the beginning of a new era for the Tudor dynasty, one that would leave an indelible mark on England and the world. In a way, Anne Boleyn's life and death were not just her own. They were the catalyst for a profound shift in England's political landscape, leading to the rise of a new, more powerful monarchy. Her fall set in motion the forces that would create one of the most successful and enduring monarchies in history. And while she may have lost her life at the hands of those who sought her downfall, Anne's legacy lived on in ways that no one, not even she, could have predicted. What does Anne's rise and fall say about the role of women in shaping history, even in times of great adversity? Anne Boleyn's life is a striking example of how women have been able to rise to power and shape history in ways that defied the traditional norms of their time. In the male-dominated world of the 16th century, Anne's story is as much about her ambition as it is about the gender expectations she had to fight against. What makes her story even more extraordinary is the sheer audacity of her rise to power in a royal court where the roles of women were largely confined to marriage, motherhood, and the shadow of their husbands. Anne Boleyn's ambition was not born out of vanity but necessity. She understood the limited power and influence women were allowed in her time and sought to break free from those restrictions. Her remarkable ability to navigate the treacherous world of the Tudor court, where political alliances could make or break a life, was not just a stroke of luck. She was cunning, strategically placing herself in the right circumstances at the right time to gain favor with Henry VIII. She knew the value of of her own intelligence and charm, but most importantly, she understood the political games. Anne's defiance of authority was her hallmark. From refusing to become Henry VIII's mistress to demanding marriage before taking her place as queen, Anne showed that she was not content to be a passive figure in history. Her refusal to follow the path laid out for women of her status was revolutionary. Most women in her position would have jumped at the chance to be Henry's mistress, accepting the secondary position and the less risky life that came with it. But Anne saw this as a trap, and she wanted more. She believed that if she was to hold any real power, she had to be queen, and she was willing to make it happen on her own terms. The fact that she succeeded in achieving such high status, not just as a queen but as a political player in her own right, was groundbreaking. She used her position to advance the Protestant cause, influence court politics, and even directly challenge the Catholic Church. But despite all this, Anne's downfall is a tragic reminder of the limited power women had in this time. Her ultimate fate, the way she was accused, tried, and executed on charges that many believe were politically motivated, shows just how precarious it was to be a woman in power during the Tudor era. When a man like Henry VIII became frustrated with her inability to bear him a son, Anne's once high status crumbled in a matter of months. Anne's tragic fall did not diminish her influence, however. Far from it. She left behind a legacy that would reverberate through history, most notably in the reign of her daughter, Elizabeth of Tudors. Elizabeth, the daughter of a queen who had been executed, would rise to become one of the most successful monarchs in English history, leading her country through an era of prosperity and power. Anne's defiance set a precedent for Elizabeth's own political maneuvering and success. Elizabeth too would face immense challenges because of her gender, but she turned those challenges into opportunities, ruling a powerful nation and asserting herself on the world stage in a way that no woman had before. Anne's story therefore highlights a crucial point, that even in a time when women were not supposed to wield power, some women, like Anne, managed to make their mark on history. Anne's life shows us how women have always had to work twice as hard to prove themselves, how they had to be more strategic, more ambitious, and sometimes even more ruthless than their male counterparts to get the same opportunities. What is truly remarkable about Anne's life, though, is not just that she rose to power, but how her story inspired future generations of women. Her defiance in the face of a system built to oppress women became a symbol of resistance. Though Anne was ultimately executed, her legacy lives on in the fact that she became the first woman in history to successfully challenge the patriarchal monarchy in such a dramatic way. She was a symbol for women who dared to fight for more than just their assigned roles. Moreover, Anne's death was the catalyst for her daughter's rise. It was a tragic irony that Anne's own personal destruction paved the way for Elizabeth to reign. Anne's story demonstrates how, for women in power, personal tragedy often becomes the fuel for change. Though Anne's execution stripped her of her crown and her life, it ultimately created a path for Elizabeth, who would go on to rule for 45 years, cementing the Tudor dynasty and becoming an iconic symbol of female power. This tragic yet inspiring narrative reflects the broader struggle for women's rights and power throughout history. Women like Anne were often trapped in a cycle of rising to power only to fall because of their gender, but each fall also paved the way for the next woman to rise. And while Anne may have been executed, she left a legacy that cannot be erased. So, what can we learn from Anne Boleyn's rise and fall? Anne's story shows that women's power in history has always been shaped by both the obstacles they face and their ability to break free from those constraints. Anne's life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations that women have historically faced, but also inspires us to celebrate the ways in which they have defied those limitations and shaped the course of history. Anne's impact on women's roles in politics and society cannot be overstated. She carved a path that many women, both then and in later centuries, would follow. Catherine the Great, or even modern political leaders, the defiance, ambition, and intelligence that Anne Boleyn demonstrated helped pave the way for women to demand their place in history. What happened behind the scenes of Anne's execution that no one talks about? Anne Boleyn's execution was not just a royal punishment, it was a carefully orchestrated political move designed to eliminate her as a threat. Most people know the bare facts. She was executed by beheading on charges of adultery, treason, and incest. But what if I told you that her execution was far more than a simple execution of justice, and that there were elements of the entire process that remain shrouded in intrigue to this day? One of the most disturbing aspects of Anne's execution is the fact that it was carried out in the most public way possible. This wasn't just about getting rid of a queen who had fallen out of favor. This was a spectacle meant to send a message. Her execution was staged to humiliate her, and in the process, it revealed how the monarchy used power to manipulate public perception. The method of execution itself is another point of deep interest. Anne's execution was not the typical public hanging that most criminals faced. Instead, she was beheaded by a French swordsman whom many believe was brought in specifically because he was skilled enough to ensure a swift, clean death. This choice of executioner has caused speculation over the years. Was it a simple practical choice, or was it meant to ensure Anne's death was as proper and dignified as possible given the circumstances? Some argue that this was done to mitigate the public perception of Anne's death, making her execution more of a merciful act in contrast to the gruesome end typically reserved for traitors. But was it really merciful? Anne's final moments before her death had been the subject of much speculation and debate. We know that she had time to reflect on her life. After all, the execution was delayed for several hours. Anne spent her final hours in the Tower of London, making peace with her fate. But did she truly accept it? Many believe Anne's final words were a calculated message. She addressed the crowd with dignity, saying, "Good Christian people, I am come here to die, according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die. Therefore I shall speak nothing against it." But what if those words were meant to leave a hidden message? Some have speculated that Anne's calm acceptance was not a sign of submission, but rather a clever political statement. Was this her way of showing the people that, despite the charges, she had been wronged? By proclaiming her innocence in the same breath as accepting her fate, Anne could have been sending a message of defiance, a message that hinted at a larger conspiracy behind her downfall. And let's not forget the timing of Anne's execution. It took place on May 19, 1536, only a day after her trial. The rapidity of this process was abnormal, and it raises serious questions about the fairness of the trial itself. The speed with which Anne was condemned to death left no time for a fair trial. Could it be that her enemies were so determined to see her dead that they hastened her execution for fear of a potential appeal or reprieve? Anne's downfall was not just the result of her failing to produce a male heir, but also the growing political and religious turmoil of the time. Her death was a way to solidify Henry VIII's power and ensure that the political establishment remained firmly in control. This sense of urgency around Anne's execution suggests that there were elements of political maneuvering at play behind the scenes, something we still don't fully understand. While many people view Anne's death simply as the tragic end of a powerful but fallen queen, the truth is more complicated. Anne's execution was an example of how the monarchy could manipulate public opinion and wield its power to eliminate threats. It wasn't just a personal matter for Henry. Her execution sent a strong message to anyone who would challenge the throne, or in this case, the king's absolute authority. The aftermath of Anne's execution also tells us something about the use of power in the Tudor era. In a time when monarchs had near total control over their kingdoms, Anne's death was a perfect example of how justice could be bent to serve political agendas. Her trial was a mockery of justice, and her execution was the final act of a play that was never meant to give her a fair chance. Anne's death was a politically charged spectacle, designed not only to eliminate her but to make sure no one ever challenged Henry VIII's power again. The execution of Anne Boleyn also set a dangerous precedent. It showed the world that even a queen, the mother of a future monarch, could be eliminated if she was deemed no longer useful to the crown. What's most troubling is that, even after her death, Anne's reputation remained under attack. She was framed as a villain in many historical accounts, and for centuries, her role in history was seen as that of a schemer and a traitor. But the reality is far more complex, and the true story behind her execution remains one of the greatest political cover-ups in history. This political move by Henry VIII didn't just mark the end of Anne Boleyn's life. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in English history, a chapter where political intrigue, power struggles, and manipulation became the new norm. Her death was a reminder of how dangerous it could be to challenge those at the top of the hierarchy. It also sent a chilling message to those who would come after her. That power could be taken away swiftly and decisively, even from those closest to the king. So what does Anne's execution really say about the nature of power in Tudor England? It reveals just how fragile one's position could be, even for someone as seemingly untouchable as a queen. Anne was a political pawn, but she also became a symbol of defiance. Her execution, though tragic, only cemented her legacy as a woman who dared to stand up against a system that was rigged against her. In the end, Anne's execution wasn't just about her downfall. It was about the larger forces of power and politics at play in the Tudor court. Her death became a warning to all those who dared to challenge the monarchy. But as history has shown, it also became a symbol of resistance. Anne Boleyn may have died at the hands of those who wanted to silence her, but her legacy lives on as a testament to the resilience of those who refuse to be forgotten, even in the face of overwhelming odds. How does Anne Boleyn's story remain relevant in today's world? Anne Boleyn's legacy continues to echo through history, leaving a profound impact on modern society that still shapes our discussions about power, gender, and politics. Her life has been immortalized in books, films, and documentaries, and her story continues to inspire and provoke thought on various issues. But why does a 16th century queen still matter so much today? And what does Anne's story teach us about the challenges women still face in the world? The most significant reason Anne Boleyn remains relevant is her role as a pioneering figure who challenged the norms of her time. Anne was more than just the second wife of Henry VIII. She was a woman who navigated and ultimately shaped the complex political and religious landscape of Tudor England. She rose to power in an era when women were often seen as pawns in the game of politics. Yet Anne broke through those constraints to become one of the most influential women in history. Her ambitious and calculated rise to the throne offers valuable insights into the way ambition, intellect, and manipulation can be used to break free from restrictive gender roles. Anne's ability to harness the political dynamics of her time, use her charm and wit, and rise above the traditional expectations placed upon women of her class left a lasting legacy. She became a symbol of female agency at a time when women had very few rights. Her refusal to settle for traditional roles, either as a mistress or passive consort, redefined what it meant to be a powerful woman woman in a male-dominated world. Anne's defiance of authority and her eventual downfall at the hands of those in power are still very much relevant today. Her story speaks to the dynamics of power, control, and corruption that continue to affect the political landscape worldwide. The manner in which her enemies used lies, slander, and manipulation to bring her down is a familiar story in modern politics. Anne's story serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly power can turn against those who seem untouchable. It's a tale that continues to resonate with anyone who has ever faced an uphill battle against authority or social expectations. While Anne's tragic end could be seen as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition, it also highlights the continuing fight for women's rights and equality. Anne's legacy is frequently used as a case study in gender studies programs around the world. She defied the stereotypes of her time, often portrayed as a cunning and manipulative woman, and instead emerged as a model for modern feminists who argue that women can and should be able to break free from societal constraints. Her story challenges the myth that women's power is solely derived from their relationships with men, illustrating how a woman can be powerful in her own right, even when the odds are stacked against her. In modern times, Anne Boleyn has become a symbol of resistance, the ultimate underdog who dared to push against the walls of patriarchal society. Her story has inspired countless works of art, literature, and film, all of which keep her legacy alive in the public imagination. Filmmakers and authors continue to use her as an archetype of strength, beauty, and tragedy, someone who, despite her fall from grace, made an indelible mark on history. Anne has become a figure that transcends her own time, a historical character whose complexities resonate across the centuries. Modern feminism has also looked to Anne's story as a lesson on how women, even in positions of power, are often judged harshly for stepping outside their prescribed roles. Anne's execution for crimes she may not have committed, or at least not as the evidence presented suggests, is a stark reminder of how women, especially those who dare to defy male-dominated power structures, can become the targets of immense injustice. Her death serves as a reminder of how easily power can manipulate public perception and shape historical narratives, particularly when it involves a woman who might have otherwise been seen as a threat to the existing power structure. Her tragic fate speaks to the ways women are often vilified for showing ambition or pursuing power, while their male counterparts are praised for similar traits. This is an ongoing issue in modern society, where women in leadership positions continue to be scrutinized more harshly than men. Anne Boleyn's rise to power and her subsequent fall is a story that can be applied to any woman in modern times who faces opposition simply for asserting her rights or desires. But perhaps most interestingly, Anne's life and death force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how history is written and who gets to tell it. For centuries, Anne was painted as a schemer and a seductress, the woman who manipulated Henry VIII to get what she wanted, and ultimately paid the price for it. It wasn't until more recently that historians and scholars began to reconsider her legacy and look at the broader forces that shaped her life and death. Anne's story is a reminder of how history is often shaped by those in power, and how a woman's legacy can be distorted or manipulated by those who seek to control the narrative. This theme of rewriting history continues to be relevant today, as many marginalized voices, particularly women, are still fighting to have their stories heard and their truths acknowledged. Anne Boleyn also represents the complexities of women's roles in power structures, showing that women are not simply victims or villains, but multifaceted individuals with the ability to change history. The way Anne used her position at court, her intellect, and her relationships with key political figures to shape her destiny, even while knowing how precarious her situation was, serves as a lesson for modern-day women who want to make a difference in the world. In conclusion, Anne Boleyn's relevance in the modern world extends far beyond her place in history. As the second wife of Henry VIII and the mother of Elizabeth I, she serves as a symbol of ambition, defiance, and the complexities of women in power. Her story remains a powerful example of how women, no matter the time or place, can fight to reshape their world and challenge the systems that seek to hold them down. Whether seen as a tragic victim, a political mastermind, or both, Anne's legacy is a testament to the enduring struggle for women's rights and the power of female resilience. How has Anne Boleyn's story influenced modern pop culture in unexpected ways? You might think that Anne Boleyn's influence on modern pop culture is limited to history books and period dramas, but you'd be wrong. Over the centuries, Anne's life has been portrayed and reinterpreted in countless ways, influencing everything from literature to film to music, shaping how we view gender, power, and politics. What makes Anne Boleyn such a figure of fascination even in modern times? And what is it about her story that continues to captivate audiences across centuries? One of the most significant ways Anne Boleyn's story influences pop culture is through her transformation from a royal mistress to the Queen of England, a rise to power that is both incredible and tragic. Anne's story breaks so many molds, and it's no surprise that she remains an iconic figure in contemporary discussions about women in power. From her time in the Tudor court, she navigated a world where women had little agency, and yet, through her wit, charm, and political acumen, she managed to change the course of English history. Today, she is the subject of numerous films, books, and television series that seek to retell her complex story, often presenting her as a defiant, misunderstood, and sometimes villainous character. Take, for example, the 2000 2008 film Elle, the Other Boleyn Girl, which portrays Anne's rise to power alongside her sister Mary. This film, and others like it, reimagines Anne as a woman who fought for survival and prominence in a dangerous political world. But here's the twist. Much of the popular narrative casts Anne as a schemer, someone whose ambition led to her downfall. But is that really the case? Modern portrayals continue to wrestle with whether Anne was a tragic victim or a clever manipulator, with interpretations often depending on the societal perspectives and expectations of the time in which the work was produced. Even in the most recent adaptations, Anne's motivations and her role in history continue to be scrutinized and redefined by filmmakers, allowing modern viewers to engage with her legacy in new ways. But it's not just films that tell Anne's story. Her legacy has seeped into the music world as well. Artists have written about her life, her power struggles, and her tragic end, using her story as a metaphor for personal struggles, defiance, and the consequences of ambition. A particularly striking example is the song Anne Boleyn by the band The Righteous Brothers, which explores Anne's internal struggles and ultimate fate, using her as a symbol for the misunderstood and maligned. Pop culture frequently uses her tragic story to highlight the emotional and personal toll of pursuing power, and in doing so, it connects Anne's life to universal themes of love, betrayal, and loss. But Anne's influence isn't confined to just historical dramas or music. She's a fixture in the ongoing conversations about women's rights and gender dynamics. The fact that Anne is still being discussed and dissected in contemporary feminist circles is a testament to her lasting impact. Anne has become a symbol of a woman who dared to challenge the norms of her time, a woman who, despite the many forces working against her, rose to power in a way that was rarely seen in her era. In an age where women's rights continue to be a topic of discussion, Anne's life offers an ongoing source of inspiration. She shows us that women can not only rise to positions of power, but can also reshape the political landscape, even when the odds are stacked against them. For modern feminists, Anne's story represents both triumph and tragedy. On the one hand, her ability to rise to the throne, against all expectations, is a monumental achievement. On the other hand, her tragic end serves as a cautionary tale about the price of challenging patriarchal structures. In modern pop culture, Anne often becomes a symbol of how power dynamics can devastate those who defy traditional gender roles. Her story is a reminder that even the most powerful women are vulnerable to the machinations of those around them, yet also serves as a call to action for future generations to continue challenging the status quo. And it's not just feminist readings that make Anne relevant. Her life and death have also inspired works of art and literature that examine the darker side of power, the consequences of manipulating and being manipulated in the pursuit of dominance. Anne's execution, carried out with a swift public brutality, speaks to the fragility of power and how easily the tides can turn. Her story is often used in literature and film to explore the ways in which those in positions of power are vulnerable to the political forces they've helped create. In pop culture, this is often portrayed in the form of power-hungry villains, and Anne becomes a cautionary figure representing the perils of ambition. Despite her execution, Anne's legacy has continued to shape the way women in history are portrayed. Whereas in her time, women were often seen as secondary characters in the grand drama of politics, Anne's life makes her central to the narrative. She represents an era when a woman was seen as nothing more than a vessel for bearing heirs, yet she managed to elevate herself into one of the most important figures in English history. In today's world, where women's roles in history are continually being re-examined, Anne Boleyn's story continues to be a powerful tool for questioning the representation of women in historical and contemporary narratives. One rare and often overlooked fact about Anne's influence in pop culture is how her story has transcended traditional media and found a place in digital platforms like social media. Platforms such as Instagram and TikTok have seen a surge in content focused on historical figures, and Anne Boleyn has become a popular subject of online discussion. People now debate her legacy, question the justice of her execution, and reinterpret her story in the context of modern political movements. The way Anne's life has been adapted and reclaimed by modern social media is a testament to her timeless relevance in the conversation about power, gender, and history. As we look at Anne Boleyn's ongoing impact on modern pop culture, it's clear that her influence stretches far beyond the history books. She is more than just a tragic figure from the past. She is an enduring symbol of defiance, resilience, and the complexity of women's roles in shaping the world. Through books, films, songs, or social media, Anne Boleyn's story continues to resonate with audiences, providing us with both a window into the past and a lens through which we can understand the present. Ultimately, Anne's place in modern culture speaks volumes about how much her life continues to captivate the imagination. Her complex character and tragic fate make her an endlessly fascinating figure, one whose legacy will likely continue to evolve and inspire future generations. From the royal courts of Tudor England to the present day, Anne Boleyn's story is not just a part of history, it's a part of our ongoing conversation about the role of women in power and the struggles they face in asserting their agency against the forces that seek to control them. How has Anne Boleyn's story influenced modern pop culture in unexpected ways? Anne Boleyn's life has echoed through history for centuries, but her influence extends far beyond the confines of textbooks. In fact, her impact is deeply ingrained in modern pop culture, inspiring inspiring everything from movies to music, literature, and beyond. What is it about her story that makes her so fascinating, so captivating, and why does her legacy continue to shape how we perceive power, gender, and ambition today? Anne's tale is often recounted as one of political intrigue, love, betrayal, and ultimate tragedy. What's truly remarkable is how she has transcended her historical role to become an enduring symbol in pop culture. Her complex life, marked by both her rise to power and its ultimate collapse, offers an endless well of inspiration for artists and filmmakers. Her story raises questions about the role of women in history, how gender has been viewed through the lens of power, and the consequences of defiance in a patriarchal world. So let's dive in as we explore how Anne Boleyn continues to inspire art, movies, books, and even social movements in ways that go beyond the pages of history. One of the most striking ways Anne Boleyn has influenced pop culture is through the portrayal of her life and legacy in films and literature. Anne's rise from a mere court lady to the Queen of England and her subsequent fall offers a dramatic arc that resonates with modern audiences. Films like The Other Boleyn Girl, 2008, which depicts Anne's relationship with King Henry VIII, reimagine's Anne's ascent and tragic fall, often casting her as a woman driven by ambition, seeking power at all costs. While the movie's portrayal of Anne is more dramatic than entirely accurate, it reflects a contemporary fascination with the complexities of her character and how ambition and love intersect in the corridors of power. What's interesting is how Anne's character has evolved in pop culture. While some portray her as an ambitious woman willing to use any means necessary to reach the throne, others portray her as a tragic figure caught in a web of political manipulation. Take, for example, the numerous novels about her life, Wolf Hollow by Hilary Mantel and the historical fiction by Alison Weir. Both present Anne in complex shades, not just as the woman who caused Henry VIII to break from the Catholic Church, but as a victim of the ruthless political and religious power struggles that surrounded her. In these works, Anne is not just a political pawn, but a woman with her own ambitions, dreams, and struggles against the patriarchal system of her time. While films and books have shaped how we view Anne's character, it's also fascinating to see how her influence extends beyond traditional media. In pop music, for instance, Anne's story has inspired various songs, some that capture her tragic fate and others that explore the broader themes of power and gender. Anne has become a symbol of defiance, her rise to the throne seen as a powerful statement about the potential for women to challenge the established order. Consider the song Anne Boleyn by the Righteous Brothers, which taps into the tragedy of Anne's life and her desperate fight to maintain power. Such songs reflect Anne's enduring relevance and how her story is used to comment on broader societal themes, especially regarding women's roles and the consequences of challenging authority. Music, like film and literature, continually reinterprets Anne's journey, shaping her not just as a historical figure, but as an icon for defiance and the pursuit of power, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And it's not just modern fiction or music that keeps Anne's legacy alive. Anne Boleyn's story has also been embraced by feminist movements over the years. Many see her as one of the first women to break the mold of being a passive figure in history, fighting her way to a position of unparalleled influence in a man's world. Her story resonates with feminists today because it touches on issues of gender, power, and the politics of dominance, issues that remain relevant in modern society. In this light, Anne is both a cautionary tale and a role model, a woman who rose to power despite the odds, only to be betrayed by those closest to her. However, Anne's influence in pop culture isn't just confined to books and movies. Her impact can be seen in how her story is consumed and discussed in more modern, interactive platforms. For instance, on social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok, Anne Boleyn is often the subject of short, engaging posts that highlight different aspects of her life. These platforms have created a space for fans and historians alike to share facts, theories, and interpretations about Anne, turning her into a subject of everyday conversation. From debates about her innocence to reimaginings of her character, Anne continues to spark new discussions in the digital age, where her narrative is dissected, reworked, and shared in real time. The way Anne Boleyn's story has permeated modern culture is a testament to her lasting influence. She remains a focal point in conversations about power dynamics, gender, and the precarious nature of political life. In many ways, she symbolizes the complexities of navigating a male-dominated world, whether through sheer ambition, intellect, or defiance. A modern fascination with Anne's life story highlights not just the enduring appeal of historical narratives, but also how those narratives continue to shape our understanding of contemporary issues. What's even more compelling is how her life continues to be reinterpreted for new generations. While her tragic death in 1536 was a brutal political maneuver, her legacy has evolved over time. Anne Boleyn is no longer merely a footnote in history books. She's a cultural force, a figure who represents both the dangers and possibilities that come with power. From historical documentaries to pop culture references, Anne's image endures, and with each retelling, her story becomes both more iconic and more mysterious. In the realm of pop culture, Anne Boleyn is often presented as a figure both sympathetic and complex. Whether it's a film that portrays her as a tragic, misunderstood queen, or a historical novel that delves into her role in the Protestant Reformation, her story is malleable. It speaks to our collective fascination with with power, betrayal, and the people who challenge the rules. Through these lenses, Anne has become more than a historical figure. She's a symbol of ambition, resilience, and the tragic consequences of political warfare. Ultimately, Anne's enduring legacy in pop culture speaks to something deeper, a desire to understand power, influence, and the role of women in history. Her rise, fall, and eventual execution are not just historical events. They're a reminder of the fragility of power, the dangers of unchecked ambition, and the complexities of human nature. From films to music, literature to social media, Anne Boleyn's story continues to captivate and inspire, proving that some legacies are built to last for centuries. Why does Anne Boleyn's death continue to be shrouded in mystery and intrigue? Anne Boleyn's death, one of the most dramatic moments in English history, remains an unsolved puzzle that has baffled historians and sparked endless speculation for centuries. The story of her final days is not just a tale of political betrayal and royal power plays, but a gripping mystery that continues to captivate audiences around the world. Why did Henry VIII, the man who once adored her, turn against her so fiercely? Were the charges that led to her execution true, or were they merely a fabricated scheme to rid him of an inconvenient queen? And why does this event, over 500 years later, still haunt us? Most people think Anne Boleyn's death was a straightforward political move. Her enemies accused her of adultery, incest, and treason, and she was executed at the command of her husband, King Henry VIII. But the reality is much more complicated. Many modern historians and theorists argue that Anne was the victim of a conspiracy, a victim of the cutthroat political game of 16th century England. The question of whether Anne was guilty or innocent continues to haunt us because, in truth, we may never know the full extent of her guilt or innocence. The official account of Anne's death, as recorded by those in power, painted her as a villainess, someone whose crimes were so extreme that they justified her execution. But the evidence used to convict her was anything but solid. In fact, much of it was based on hearsay, fabricated confessions, and unreliable testimonies. In a society where royal power often manipulated justice, how can we be sure she was guilty of the charges leveled against her? The mystery around her execution doesn't just rest on the question of her innocence, but on the larger issue of how power can manipulate and control the narrative of history. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Anne's death is the manner in which it was executed. Publicly and brutally, Anne was beheaded on Tower Green, with a small crowd of onlookers and a carefully chosen executioner. The fact that her execution was so public, so humiliating, adds to the mystery. Was this an attempt to make an example of her, or was it part of a larger political maneuver to solidify Henry's reign and send a message to the court? This wasn't just about removing Anne from power. It was about controlling her legacy, silencing her, and rewriting the history of her time. The stakes were higher than simply eliminating the queen. This was a message to any would-be rivals, showing that no one was above the king's wrath. But perhaps the most intriguing element of Anne's execution was the behavior of her last moments. In the days leading up to her death, Anne displayed remarkable poise and grace. Despite knowing that she would likely face death, she maintained a dignified composure, never admitting guilt for the crimes she was accused of. Even in her final moments, Anne's strength was palpable. She claimed her innocence and remained defiant until the very end. But her last words, "I died the Queen of England, but I feel myself innocent," have sparked a range of interpretations. Were these words an act of defiance, a final refusal to admit guilt, or was there something more to them? Historians still debate whether Anne's final words were a calculated attempt to preserve her dignity, or whether they were a subtle message to Henry VIII. Some speculate that her innocence could have been real, that she was merely a pawn in a larger political scheme. Others argue that, despite the lack of hard evidence, her crimes were true. Was Anne truly guilty, or was she a victim of political scheming? As we peer into the past, it becomes clear that the truth about Anne's death may never be fully known. What makes Anne's death even more haunting is that it set a dangerous precedent for future political trials. The manner in which Anne's fate was sealed, through manipulation, false charges, and the distortion of justice, illustrates how easily royal power could dictate the course of history. Anne's death was a turning point in England's history, marking the end of one reign and the beginning of another, as her daughter Elizabeth would rise to the throne and shape England's future. Yet, the mystery of Anne's death isn't just limited to the political forces at play. It also speaks to the fragility of power itself. Anne's story is a reminder that, in the world of royalty, no one is safe. Even the queen could be brought down by the whims of a king, by the ambitions of rivals, and by the fickle nature of power. Her tragic end serves as a chilling reminder that, in this world, power is fleeting and loyalty can vanish in an instant. And so, Anne Boleyn's death remains one of history's greatest mysteries. The questions surrounding her execution continue to stir debate, challenge assumptions, and keep us guessing. Either whether she was guilty or innocent may never be resolved, but her story and her tragic end will continue to shape the way we understand the complexities of power, politics, and human nature for generations to come. As we look back on her life, it's impossible not to feel the lingering mystery of her death, a mystery that is likely to remain unsolved for as long as history is remembered. If you enjoyed this epic journey, please subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical tales. Don't miss out on new videos. Hit the notification bell to stay updated.